over the next couple of weeks here. With that, I think we'll, with that, we'll stand for any questions you have. And thanks again for having us here.
Is there a web link or something?
This document will be published on the Environment Department's website today. It's going live during this meeting. It'll be. We wanted to give the CAB the exclusive first look, but it will be out by before 5 p.m. today. It will be about 5. It'll be live online today at the Environment Department's website, which I just go to my favorites, so I'm not even sure what our is it. It's www.env.state.
I do the same thing.
Okay. I'll get you our website. I literally just go to my favorites, and it's right there. So.
Thank you.
But if you Google New Mexico Environment Department, you find us right away.
Thank you, Secretary Flynn and Katie. We appreciate the presentation. I guess at this time we're going to take some questions. George got his.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So we'll start with Gerard.
Mr. Secretary and Mr. Roberts, thank you so much for the presentation. And Mr. Roberts, thank you to you and your staff for putting this all together. And I know there's a lot of hard work and some to come. We share in your goal of the returning to active cleanup status. And in regards to your dynamic process, also with the cleanup, we want to get back to the safe delivery of waste to WIP. Regarding the dynamic process, we really appreciate you taking our concerns recently about the SEPs and providing a whole process for that in itself. With that in mind, we took a look at the page 68 through 70 and section 35 under penalties, and would like to know if you would consider a statement indicating the penalties would be transferred to a fund that would support SEPs. And is that a possibility to put that into this document and we have it in place that we wouldn't have to kind of revisit supporting that again?
So, Gerard, thank you for the comment, and I'll start and say yes, that's possible, and we would certainly welcome that feedback. So I think there are, again, this is our effort to get the conversation started, but if you wanted to propose some specific language about how to really ensure, I think the spirit of the SEPs, which we heard you loud and clear, and we agreed, I mean, that's why we went that approach for the fines and penalties, was because that's money that's been appropriated for work in the communities, and it should go back into the communities. So I think we thought you all made a very good point, and that's why we went that way for the prior compliance orders. And I certainly like that process, and would be open to language that would provide that flexibility. There is still flexibility in the language. I think, particularly in paragraph 7 on page 69, where we can agree to to reduce or waive stipulated penalties, where I think we might be able to kind of maybe play with that language a little bit to actually specifically talk about using SEPs for penalties or in lieu of penalties in certain areas. So I think there's a lot of different areas where you could build that in here. The only other thing I mentioned, I wanted to draw your attention to, but if you looked at page 68 in paragraph 4 of the document, if you look at the bottom of that, so paragraph 4 on page 68 of the document, it's a big document. I'll give you a second to find it if you're all, for those of you following at home.
I thought you didn't know this document.
No, I know. I play dumb, so I try to set the bar really low. So if you go to that paragraph, it says, consistent with RCRA practice, for each failure of DOE to meet a milestone subject to stipulated penalties, and NMED may assess a stipulated penalty in the amounts and pursuant to the procedures set forth in this section. This is the big sentence here. Payment for any and all stipulated penalties assessed under this consent order shall not be diverted from either the operational or environmental remediation budget at LANL. So that, it's not directly what you were talking about, but that was something that the CAB, the regional coalition, Carlsbad, a number of stakeholders talked about that issue previously, and we heard you loud and clear. And so that specific language that we've proposed here in this document is, again, getting at kind of that same issue that you with the SEPs, which is, look, we don't want money that's been appropriated to go directly into the communities, to benefit the communities through cleanup work, to just for me to fine it and to use that to make up for a budget shortfall in the state legislature. I'm not saying that, that I'm not sympathetic. I mean, I work for the state legislature. They set my budget every year, so I'm very sympathetic to budget shortfalls. But really, this money belongs to the communities, and it was appropriated by Congress to directly benefit the communities. So I don't want to create a process where fining the facility actually detracts from work at the site or detracts from operations. I don't want programs at Los Alamos to be jeopardized because of a failure for legacy cleanup. So that's really what we're trying to do, is to separate this, that if there is a problem, it shouldn't come out of the community. It shouldn't be taken away from the community or from the facility itself. So I thought I would just draw your attention to that language, since that was something we've spent a lot of time working on internally, trying to figure out how to build that into this document.
Mr. Chair and Mr. Secretary, I did read that, and I just kind of took it for granted, so thank you for putting that language in there. The two reasons we want to have the SEPs in there are definitely because we think there's good work that will be done through this process that you're undertaking right now. Number two is to protect any type of fund rate from the legislature as well. So at any time that type of language, much like it came up recently, that we have protection right away, and says it's absolutely in the consent language. We cannot do that. But again, thank you for putting this language in. Thank you for listening to us, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Do we have anybody else at this time? Okay, Nana. Nona, it's your stand.
Thanks, Chair and Secretary Ryan. When you just said that you wanted any fines not to impact cleanup, that of course is good, but if you say it's not to impact any programs at LANL, it has to impact something to actually be a threat, or, that those managing the cleanup would actually, take into consideration that the fine is something worth avoiding. If it just comes out of somewhere else entirely unrelated to LANL, then it's not much of incentive to keep them focused on that.
Can I comment on your comment? So, sure, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
No.
Nana Girardi.
Nana? Okay. Nana, well, thank you for your comment, and I don't disagree with you at all. I think the main point you're making is, look, there needs to be some risk or pressure involved, or threat, if you will, to compel compliance. And so I don't disagree with that at all. And I think what's happened here, and what the document also speaks to, is the fact that there's another entity who's involved here, and that is the contractor for the site itself. And so what happens in practice here is that when we issue a fine or a penalty, where that liability is actually borne out is on the contractor side. And that's if we go back to the SEPs, that money for those SEPs, that's where that came from. The performance bonus for the contractor managing the facility was withheld last year, and that a large portion of those SEPs is being paid directly out of that performance bonus. So I think that, for me, again, the biggest issue is we want to make sure that there absolutely needs to be pressure, and so you need to identify pressure points. The problem that we've had that we're trying to address, though, is that the Department of Energy, when we've initially issued penalties for the problems at WIP that were, honestly created up at LANL, the Department of Energy, the headquarters response was to say, well, when you fine us, guess where we're going to take that money out of? Your environmental cleanup budget. And we said that was unacceptable, and you all had kind of spoke about that not being acceptable either, because that's effectively punishing us for their own failures. So I think we're on the same page in terms of we need to make sure that, first of all, we're not punished, our work doesn't suffer, but there also needs to be pressure points to force the department to actually address the issues rather than just kind of find another line item someplace else and move money and not actually fix the problems which led to a fine. And what I think actually occurs in practice here, and what is discussed in this document, is the interaction between the Department of Energy and their actual contractors. And that's really what you're going to, where the contractors have a financial incentive that the federal government doesn't have. They literally print money, whereas our contractors, they're private entities who are in a for-profit enterprise. When you withhold their performance bonuses, that's something that puts a huge amount of pressure on them to perform. So I think that's how I would kind of envision the liability being the risk being borne out. It's going to be borne out on the contractors who are actually doing the work. And the department already does that through the contracts that they have in place with their contractors that allow them to, when there is a fine imposed, to take that away from the contractors. And that occurred here in our situation. That occurred years ago. There was $1 million penalty assessed against the Department of Energy in 2010, I believe, and that $1 million fine came from the contractor at the site. And again, they still talk about that fine, and they still are upset about the performance bonus being withheld. So I guess that's my kind of response, is where I see a pressure point is on the contractor at the site being accountable ultimately for any failures that are penalized. But if you've got better ideas, that's why we're here today. So. Thanks. I appreciate the comment.
Secretary Flynn, Katie, thank you for the good work that you did on this document here. It's put together very well and in a very short period of time. I didn't expect to see this soon, but it's a lot of work, I can see. Am I right in guessing that Department of Energy sat down with your folks? You guys came to an agreement with what's in this document already?
No. The Department of Energy, we've certainly received feedback from the Department of Energy over the past couple weeks on ways that they think the consent order could be enhanced, but we haven't reached any agreements with the Department of Energy, nor will we until the comment period closes. So I think we're certainly listening to the Department of Energy. We've shared this document with the Department of Energy, and we absolutely will sit down with them and have many substantive conversations over the weeks and months ahead. We have received feedback from them, certainly over the past couple of weeks about areas of the current consent order where they think there could be improvements that could be made, and we've listened to their feedback, but ultimately this document is borne out by what the Environment Department staff thinks needs to occur in order to improve the document. I think we want to work with the Department of Energy. We are absolutely committed to working with the Department of Energy going forward. But it'd be tough for me to come to the public and say I want to hear from you when we've already reached an agreement on what the document should look like. So I think that's why we're putting it out for public comment today. We want to get your feedback, and armed with that feedback, then I think we can sit down and have a structured negotiation with the Department of Energy. But no, we don't have an agreement in any way with the Department of Energy on what this document will look like. Although, like I said, we did work closely with them, especially on when we talked about the campaigns, like grouping the appendices that we created. There was a lot of work done between my staff and the Department of Energy staff and on kind of what those documents would look like, how you could take the work and group it logically and come up with that process. So we've been getting feedback from them, but no agreements.
Yep, and I'm glad you said that, Secretary Flynn, because that leads into the next question I was going to ask. It's good to see that this document is campaign approach based. I see that it does say generally based upon risk, and is that the only category that they're going to use to base their campaigns upon, just risk or dollar amount or funding?
No, that's a really good question. I think risk should be the primary driver in terms of prioritizing work. And so I think, and that's easy to agree on. The problem is that, you still have to group work together and figure out how you're going to budget all of that work. So I think we've tried to group this based on risk, as well as, some other factors such as kind of geographic proximity. There are a number of, when we look at, based on the feedback we received from Los Alamos County, for example, cleaning up some of the town sites in that area is extremely important to Los Alamos County. And we view that as being, that's certainly something that we also view as being very important because it's important for the county. But I don't view that necessarily as having the same degree of risk from those town sites as certainly as chromium contamination. So I think we look at risk as a primary driver, but we've also considered other things like location of sites, of cleanup sites in making decisions. And finally, there are certain things when you go with a campaign, if you're really trying to focus on an area, and that's what a campaign does. It tries to look at, all right, how can we group work together how can we look at kind of the entire scope of work and figure out what makes sense in terms of grouping work. When you're grouping work together in an area that has a high priority, there might be other lower risk issues that are in that area that make sense to be addressed at the time when you're doing that work, because you've mobilized, you've ramped up, you have the personnel, you have that site set up and active. So it might not be a high risk site, but you're there, you're doing the work, and in order to close out that entire area, you'll take care of something that's maybe a lower risk issue, but it's located next to a higher risk issue. So then rather than just stopping and coming back 7 or 8 years down the road and spending a lot more money while you're mobilized and you're out there, might as well just knock that off. And so that's really so I think we try to move toward risk, but it's difficult when you start getting into kind of operational work and practice. You can't kind of take, I think, a purist, we're only doing the highest risk things at the same time, because there might be some lower risk issues that just make sense because you're out there, you're mobilized, and it won't cost very much to finish that. So the answer is yes, risk is a key driver, but I don't think it can be the only one in order to make the campaign approach really work very well. I'm not sure I explained that very well, but I used a lot of words. I'm not sure they made any sense, but that's really kind of what I was trying to get at, was risk is important, but it's not the only measure in terms of working it.
On page 27, the parties agree to identify in Appendix B 10 to 20 milestones. Is that per campaign every year? Is that doable? Is 10 to 20 milestones, is that per campaign?
No. Why don't you talk about it?
No, Carlos. So 10 to 20 milestones can be across multiple campaigns. So in the current draft that went out today for Appendix B, you'll see that the chromium campaign, the RDX campaign, and let's just take the historical properties campaign, all have milestones associated with them in the current FY. What you'll also see is that for the FY +1 and +2, there are also targets associated with those. And I think this is a really important distinction, okay? So between milestones and targets. Now the document itself actually defines what both of those things are. Milestones, okay, are going to be tasks, deliverables, whatever it may be, in the current FY column in Appendix B. Targets, and those are enforceable. Targets are going to be in the FY +1 and +2 columns of Appendix B. and those are not enforceable, but the intent there is to actually roll them in when we do our annual planning process.
So, Carlos, the number of milestones will vary. For
will
a
vary.
campaign, you could have 180 milestones in one campaign. So it's not really the amount of milestones for the campaign that's important. The milestones are important in terms of the work plan for the next year. So so if we're sitting there in January determining what work is going to happen in this calendar year, milestones are what governs all the work that's going to occur in the next year. Those are subject to stipulated penalties. So everything that is going to happen this year is built into a work plan that has a milestone attached, and that is enforceable. Then you have, because we don't think it makes sense to kind of just make up a new plan every year, we're really trying to have a vision toward not only what's going to happen this year, but then year 2 and year 3. So we're constantly trying to have a longer focus beyond a year. And years 2 and 3 are targets. They're not, that's just what we see happening next year and the year after. And so those are not enforceable. But after this year, we go through the annual planning process again, and you have a new year arrives and a new set of milestones arrives, and then you kind of add the next 2 years on top of that. So it's really a 3-year process. The first year has milestones built in, which are enforceable. Years 2 and 3 have targets, and those are not enforceable. They're not enforceable in the current year, but those targets will most likely become milestones once, after a year or 2.
Gotcha. Appendix B, is that in any kind of priority order? And I'm guessing it's not all-inclusive of the work that needs to be done, right? Does DOE, does EMLA have a approved life cycle baseline yet?
They do. They're not sharing it with us. That's my understanding.
That's what I was wondering. Good point.
If I can address that specific question, the EMLA field office has developed a life cycle baseline, and it is currently with our headquarters program brethren for final approval before we can release it, and they have not approved the release yet.
And
We expect it to be sometime relatively soon, maybe next couple of months.
I'm just curious how it relates to Appendix B. Does it fit right in? Is it?
Shall I finish or you?
Well, I think the other part of your question, Carlos, was does Appendix B include all of the work? And that's a somewhat involved answer. And the reason I say that is because every single campaign that will include all of the work under this consent order, each campaign is absolutely listed in Appendix B. What you'll see, though, is that when you get towards the end of Appendix B, you'll see several campaigns that have no milestones and no targets associated with them at this time. So I can address the piece about does it include all of the work? Yes, it does.
So I think what we're trying to do is populate the document so you could see how it would actually bear out. So that's what you're seeing in Appendix B. To the extent of have we determined what our priorities are? The answer is no. We're trying to populate this document in a way that we think makes sense, but that's one of the things that we need to hear from the public. Our priorities are really informed by what's most important for the stakeholders, the people in the community who are directly impacted by the work. So I think we kind of went back and forth internally as to what do we put in Appendix B? Should we just leave everything blank? And I think what we, Katie and I decided at the end was, well, you wouldn't really understand how this document is actually going to work if we would just leave it all blank. So we've tried to populate this document to reflect what's actually occurring here. In some cases, like the chromium work, there is active chromium work going on there, and we have set enforceable deadlines for some of the chromium work that's occurring right now under the current consent order. So we've tried to populate it in a way that resembles reality, but we don't, at this point, believe that we have had an opportunity to get enough feedback from the public as to what's the right prioritization of the remaining scope of work. So that's why I think that should be borne out by the feedback we receive from you. Life cycle baseline, I think so the site has been working with us. Headquarters has not shared that document with us. The only thing I would say about that document is that it's not meaningless, but I wouldn't put a whole heck of a lot of weight into it because it's built on so many different assumptions that it's like a planning exercise, but there's the assumptions that they're using to create that baseline are really speculative. In order to build that baseline as to what it's going to cost for the life of this project to complete all the work, they have to make assumptions about what remedies will be selected for cleaning up certain areas, like Area G. Yeah. And so they have to make an educated guess. The Department of Energy makes an educated guess about what we think it's going to cost to clean up that area and what remedy the state is going to require. Well, the Department of Energy can't read my mind, so they don't know what final remedy I'm ultimately going to be required for it. So it's not that they're trying to waste time and come up with this document, but they have to build in a bunch of assumptions that are based in part on decisions that are beyond their control when they actually create that document. So the document, I'm not saying it's not meaningless, but I am saying that it has so many different assumptions that are built into it that I wouldn't give a huge amount of weight to it. I mean, I certainly have asked for it. I want to see it, but
it's going to change every day.
Yeah, it'll change based on what we decide. So we say, if we tell them for Area G, no, cap and cover isn't the appropriate remedy, what we believe the appropriate remedy is to excavate this material. Then that's going to change the assumptions they used in building that document, most likely, and that's going to change the cost as well as the timeline. So that's just an example of how that baseline will be adjusted, and we haven't made that decision yet as to what the proper remedy is for Area G. So there's just so many things that are beyond the department's control when they create that document that it would be impossible for the department to come up with a life cycle baseline that was anything other than a well-educated guess as to what they think it will cost and how long it will take. Exactly.
I'm glad you used Area G as an example because that's exactly what I was thinking about. Looking at these charts on Appendix B, that's one of them that's left blank.
Yeah. And one of the things we haven't put in here either is we haven't put a final deadline in. And that's something that we've, in all honesty, been debating back and forth internally, is do we put a final deadline in? And there's pros and cons associated with that. The reason why I haven't opted to put a final cleanup deadline in place is honestly because we haven't finished the corrective measures evaluation for some of these areas. So my fear is that if I put a date in place, people will think, well, you've already predetermined what you're going to do there. And basically, you've totally undermined the public process that needs to occur as part of that remedy selection. And so that, for me, was the reason why I thought, well, why am I going to pick a date? And that would be, again, like the life cycle baseline, that would be me kind of guessing what I'm going to decide for each of these areas, or what someone after me is going to decide if we don't finish those evaluations in the next couple of years. And so we've been kind of going back and forth on that. Again, this is a draft. Those are areas where we're absolutely willing to consider a different approach. But I think what our goal was, let's focus on the near term rather than setting what we did in the past was to focus on a date 10 years from now. And as someone who's a political appointee that's subject to a political cycle, it's really easy. For me to pick a date 10 years down the road is easy because I'm not the one that's going to be sitting here when that deadline comes. And I'd rather pick dates that are meaningful today and tomorrow, a year from now, so that you can, it's harder because it puts me on the spot. But if you're really putting pressure and setting dates that with expectations for a 1 year, 2 year, and 3 year time period, there's no escaping that. Nobody who comes into these positions, whether it be on the department side or my side, gets to hide. You're you're under your scrutiny as to what we're going to do this year. And if we don't do it, you get to ask me what happened. And you can go ask my boss that, and then she can find someone else to do my job if I haven't delivered or I don't give a good answer. I mean, really, in all honesty, I think, I hate to break it down like that, but it's true. When people set dates that are 10, 20, when political appointees set dates that are 10, 20, 30 years down the road, they're setting those knowing they're not going to be there, whether it be the federal or the state side. And so I think it's another risk, is that you want to set dates when that are meaningful, that put pressure on us and the regulated entities to perform.
Just one final comment, Ryan. The CAB members just approved 2 recommendations that got sent up to DC. One of them was on the campaign approach, and I'm thinking that was approved in DC. And then, so that's good. That's good that the consent order is right along that same line. And the second one was what we thought the budget priorities should be for. I get my fiscal years mixed up. I'm thinking 18? 17? And so I'm not sure if you've seen those recommendations or not, but if you haven't, if you can possibly get a hold of the budget priorities for 17 and see how that fits into the work priorities in Appendix B, that would be super.
Okay. I've seen the campaign resolution. I haven't seen the budget priorities, but I definitely would.
Got a question?
Manisa is very good at getting all that stuff to us, so I'm sure it's on its way. She probably already sent it. I just haven't read it yet.
Okay.
The FY18 is on the agenda for today,
Okay.
but the campaign has been sent to NMED.
Okay, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Angelica, you had some questions, I thought? Did you want to ask?
Secretary Flynn, I just want to tell you thank you and Katie for being so transparent throughout this whole process and involving us in the process. I'm excited about your energy behind this. Like, I just want to see shovels in the ground and getting the environment cleaned up, and that's important to, I think, all the members on the CAB, and then as well as all the residents of surrounding Los Alamos, including Espanola and Poaque and all the pueblos. So it's exciting. Also, I just wanted to ask you, I was going to ask you about the term, but I guess that's undecided at this time for the consent order. And then also, you mentioned basically there's all this money being spent or wasted in like the permitting, the RECRA permit, and then also the discharge permit. Who's kind of responsible for that? I don't know what you would call it, but who's holding up the show on the permitting side?
Well, thank you, Angelica, for the comments. I think we want your feedback, so thank you for the kind words. In terms of the final date, again, I'm glad I answered your question, but really I am open to your feedback. If you all think we should set a final date, that's fine with me. I mean, I don't, to me, the most important thing is that there's pressure in the near terms to make sure work is occurring. But I have no problem setting a final date if that's something that you all want. So we're open to suggestions on that issue. With respect to, we spend about kind of some of the disputes that we have. I think we spend. There's plenty of blame to go around, and I'm not going to single out any particular party or entity. But I think there's. I guess I've learned in my getting more gray hair than the first time I appeared before you, but in my short tenure here now, I've been here 5 years doing at the Environment Department, 3 of which as a secretary. I think I tell my staff when we're meeting with people, is this an issue for them, or is this a problem that they want a solution to? Are they looking for an issue, or are they looking for an accomplishment? And it doesn't matter who it is. It can be a nonprofit group, it could be a regulated entity, whoever, or it could be a political figure. And if it's an issue, I judge that as someone just wants to make us think about something and get their name in the paper. They don't actually care about what the outcome is. They just want to bark and make some noise about something. And if someone, for me, I will listen, but you kind of, and I think a number of you have been in those meetings where you kind of figure out, like, someone's just making an issue of something. They're not actually proposing a solution. And that's to me the difference. When I'm with someone who is coming to me, whether it be, again, member of the public, nonprofit group, county, city, pueblo, tribe, whoever, when they come to us with a problem and they're like, hey, we're having this problem, we really need you to work with us to fix it, or here's our idea for how we're going to fix it, man, we will knock ourselves out as an agency in trying to work with whoever that is to fix that problem. And that's never, in my opinion, a poor use of government resources, is spending that time. And it can take hundreds of hours to solve those problems. But that's never a poor, from my judgment as the leader of my agency, I'm never upset that we've spent hundreds of hours of staff time working on solving a problem with someone. Where I do get upset is when we've spent hundreds of hours of staff time because it's an issue that they don't really care about what the outcome is. They're just, like in the case of the permit that I mentioned before. So there you have the Environmental Law Center in Santa Fe who's appealing this permit, and I'm not even sure who their client is, but they're really, they're really driving that issue. They haven't actually appealed the permit. They've appealed a decision I made not to grant a hearing on the permit, which is, so we're going to spend thousands and thousands of dollars fighting about something that has no bearing on the actual permit. And that was one of the issues we identified, was that, well, you haven't actually appealed the permit itself. You're complaining about the permit, but you're not actually offering any feedback about how do we actually make the permit better? Is there a condition that we should build into the permit that will actually clean this site up? And so there, it's very clear it's just an issue. They want to, they don't like me. So they'd rather, for them it's a fundraising issue. They want to be able to, as I've heard from leaders of that organization before, it's easier to raise money when people are upset or angry or afraid than it is when people are happy. So, we're going to agitate in this case, get people fired up, and that'll help us raise money. And so, for me there, we'll do our job and move forward. But that's an example in that situation of, well, that's an issue. That's not about, if they had come to us saying, hey, you know what, that we're worried about where this water is being applied, and that applying the water, the clean water in this area is actually going to lead to some erosion issues or whatever. And there it would be, all right, that's easy. I can fix that. That's something that we can work with you on. But when you're just, complaining for the sake of complaining, then I don't have much time for you. So we'll address that. We'll go to court. We'll fight it. We'll spend money that I wish we didn't have to spend. But at the same time, that's just part of the process. So, I'm sure, our congressional delegation, they have reps here. They deal with that all the time, too, where they have people who are, I'm sure there's times where they're sitting in hearings where people are just kind of grandstanding and not offering any solution. So I'm sure everybody kind of sees it occur in different realms, and so I don't think my experience is unique. Certainly, it's just what I deal with at the state level. And unfortunately, we spend a lot of money dealing with some issues for which it's not really about fixing a problem. It's just about raising money or getting someone's name in the paper.
Okay, so let me ask my second question. I think the last time you presented to us, you said that you wanted to finalize, once the CO was finalized, the new version, that you would use this as like a tool for setting goals for DOE, because LANL is one of the only laboratories that doesn't have goals, that helps leverage funding.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so last time I was here, I think I showed you a map we got from the Government Accountability Office, I believe, and it showed kind of all the dates across the complex for cleanup sites, and the only one that didn't have a date was LANL. It just said, I think, to be determined. And so, yeah, this will, once we get a final plan in place, this will give us, in my opinion, strong leverage when we go to the federal government. And I think we've put ourselves as well as our congressional delegation. I've never picked up the phone and contacted any member of the delegation and received, and just heard crickets from them when I've asked them to help us out in terms of advocating for our facilities. I can honestly tell you that, whether it's Senator Udall, Senator Heinrich, Congressman Ben Ray Lujan, they've all been supportive. Every time I call, their staff spend time with us. They want to help us out. So I think we've, in my opinion, I think we've made it difficult for them because they're having to answer that question. Well, what's the plan? And they're like, well, they're working on it. And so I think here, once we get a final plan in place, it gives them some leverage to help us out, and it gives us. We also go to DC and make requests, and so I think it gives us all the ability to articulate what can be done with the current budget. With right now, we got $189 million. We can explain very clearly in our appendix and in a document, this is the work that we'll do for $189 million. And you have a 2-year planning window built on, and you could very easily say, all right, and this is what you'll do for 220, and this is what we could do for 240, and this is what we could do for 250. And I think that information certainly helps us, and I think it helps our allies. And again, there's been no partisanship whatsoever with our delegation when it comes to advocating for money. They've always answered my phone calls and been very generous with their time and their support. So I think, a lot of times, again, we read a lot about people, about dysfunction and different parties not getting along. There's been none of that here. We've always worked well together throughout my tenure, and I think the lack of a plan has hurt them in their ability to advocate for us, and it's certainly made it challenging for me because I've been up with Office of Management budget, and I've been asked that question. Well, when are you going to have a new plan for LANL? Because the old plan, everybody knows they're not meeting that 2015 deadline. So what are you going to do? And so now, once we complete this process, we at least can answer that question.
One last question. When do you think we will finalize the CO?
No, I would anticipate within the next 3 months we'll have the consent order finalized. So the public comment period is 45 days, and then that'll be about a month and a half, and then I think we'll try to move as quickly as possible to incorporate those comments into the final document. Ultimately, we have to sit down with the Department of Energy. This is a bilateral settlement agreement. This document, it's not a permit, and we've heard a lot of different comments about kind of confusing or muddying the water about this document, about this being a permit versus not a permit. This is not a permit, as Katie told you. This is a settlement agreement between the Environment Department and the Department of Energy. And so I can't unilaterally tell them when they're going to sign it. I think, what I have heard from Secretary Moniz as Chief of Staff, the head of NNSA, and the head of the Department of Environmental Management, EM, at DOE, so the highest levels of leadership in the agency, have told me unequivocally that they are going to sit down and this is a priority and they will get this done with us as aggressively as possible. So I'm confident that once we're ready to sit down and start finally negotiating the document, that we'll get them, that they'll work with us really aggressively. And my goal would be to have this done certainly as soon as possible. If we could get it done in 3 months, I think that would be great. If we could get it done in less, that would be even better. But I think a good target for us internally has been trying to get this done by the 4th of July would be a good target. But if I can get it done sooner, I promise you we'll do it as soon as possible.
Yeah, I was going to ask Max to be as well.
Thank you very much.
Good. Max, do you have a lot of questions? If you do, we'll take a break before we get into your questions. Is that
Mr. Chairman, sometimes my question of one or two can lead a while. So if you want to take a break, I welcome that,
okay,
sir.
Why don't we go ahead and take a break then, and then we'll come back. By the way, I noticed that William's got the New Mexico Environmental Department website up. So it's www.env.nm.gov. And the consent order's listed there, so it's up. So we're getting prior information quickly. Okay. Thank you. We'll reconvene about 3. We'll go ahead and reconvene this meeting here at 3:27, and I think on the agenda is for Max to ask questions of NMED. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a thank you for the document, and I appreciate all the efforts that staff has placed into it. I just needed some real quick understanding under the penalties, the stipulated penalties, and if someone can walk me through what, as a layman's terms, what really, if we were writing up an elevator speech, what are the real stipulated penalties?
Jeff, can you take that question?
Well, Katie's here.
Okay,
Katie's over at the end of the
I'm
table.
here.
That's why I said-
Sorry. That's okay.
That's why I said we'd be kind.
So I just want to make sure I actually understood your question. So you're asking really what are stipulated penalties? What does that entail?
Just a brief description of, it's 35, page 68. The section has the stipulated penalties. So I take it you're well engrossed within this document, and maybe as we're trying to communicate to the public, I'd like to have something that's just a very, very lame, non-legalistic interpretation of it. Thank you.
Okay. I will take a shot at doing that. I'll do my best. So stipulated penalties are effectively fines that are associated with a missed milestone. That could be completion of a well, it could be submittal of a document, but if the Department of Energy fails to either complete or submit either of those things, then they are subject to fines per that section of the document.
Thank you. So in the document, if you go to section B, it has stipulated milestones, and then those milestones, if they miss those milestones, at that point, then the stipulated penalties kick in place, $1,000 for the first 30 days per day, $3,000 per day, 31 days and afterwards. How did you derive those dollar figures?
Well, those amounts were actually taken straight out of the 2005 consent order. And I think it's also important to note, though, that although they may be subject to stipulated penalties if they miss a milestone, that the NMED would actually have to assess that stipulated penalty. So there's sort of a paperwork exercise that needs to happen. And as a matter of fact, the way that the document is currently drafted, that decision is also subject to dispute resolution. So if the Department of Energy actually disagrees with NMED's decision to assess stipulated penalties, they can challenge that, and they would go through the dispute resolution process.
On section 7, page 69, it says NMED may at its discretion agree to reduce or waive stipulated penalties that would otherwise be due under this section. Under what circumstances do you think that NMED would actually waive or reduce a penalty?
That's a somewhat difficult question to answer, because I think there are several situations that could give rise to waiving or reducing those penalties. I mean, and I don't think it's probably fair of me to speculate what those situations would be, but I can envision there would be several.
Thank you, and I came to that same conclusion, so I offer that rather than having such very generic type language, to actually truly spell out under what conditions can you waive a fee, and so that it doesn't leave this ambiguous out there. Secondly, what's the interest that is if penalty is assessed? It says 28 USC 1961. Do we know what that interest rate is?
Are you under the procedure of payment, for payment?
Yes, it's on page 69, section B, item 2, second line.
So that is more of a legal citation, and I quite honestly could not tell you off the top of my head what what it entails.
Thank you. And then on this particular section, page 69, it would be number 8. DOE shall only be liable for stipulated penalties for failure to meet a milestone listed in Appendix B developed pursuant into Section 3.c. of this consent order. So when you go back to section C, it basically refers to the annual planning process. And so the annual planning process, that the way that I read it on section 1 and 2, basically at the end of the first quarter you resubmit a annual planning document. Well, if there's a dispute, then you get 10 additional days and then you got the dispute. So you could be halfway in the year and nothing's happened on that action plan. So maybe a suggestion is to have the annual planning process approved the beginning of the last quarter of that fiscal year, so that it gives you enough time to keep all the forward-moving progress of these remediations in place rather than tying it down to some bureaucratic process.
We will certainly take that under consideration. Thank you.
And then I just had one more question, Mr. Chairman. It's page 63, the extensions. It's XX number 8, page 63A. And it says a milestone shall be extended upon receipt of a timely request for extension when a good cause. I would prefer that you kind of tighten what a timely request is and also a good cause. In section B, it talks about every extension shall be in writing, but yet 3 sentences down it says, DOE may notify NMED orally. Well, when you get an oral communication, then it's interpreted to what you meant and what you thought you meant, what someone thought they meant. So I would probably urge that you strike the orally and just have everything written so that you don't have any ambiguity when an extension is granted. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. We'll take them under consideration.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Is that all the comments? Okay. A couple of comments from the chair. I think Max brought up a good point. NMED will make a determination if it's, non-conformance. Is that who's going to be the lone person or agency that makes the determination? Or are you going to take hearing on that to determine a non-performance?
I'm sorry, Doug, can you repeat that for me?
Okay. If you're looking at non-performance on some item, is NMED going to be the lone agency that makes that determination?
Yes.
Okay. And then, but will you then take public comment on that from other agencies that, you determine that there's been non-performance on this particular situation or campaign approach, and therefore are due a stipulated penalty?
Well, let me back up. So non-conformance with what? So are you talking about a milestone in Appendix B, or are you talking about the decisions made during the annual planning process?
Well, I'm just looking at your presentation, and I said stipulated penalties for non-conformance, I guess. I was just looking at that. How is that determination, that criteria going to be determined? And is it on milestones?
Yes. So stipulated penalties only apply to milestones.
Okay. So
in Appendix B. So I believe in that section of the document, it does specify should DOE miss effectively, so fail to complete or fail to submit one of those milestones, they would be subject to stipulated penalties. That decision about whether the milestone has not been achieved is the discretion of the Environment Department.
Okay. The second question I have, if you go back to the schedule, Katie, it's a pretty aggressive schedule as far as, looking at things. And I guess when you look at meeting with all the individual stakeholders, when you consider all the stakeholders, I'm saying there's a number of them that you have, whether, I mean, cities, counties, tribal entities, as well as some independent agencies. And you're trying to do that prior to the 16th, I take it, of May. Is that correct?
So we certainly intend, if any of those entities that you just named want to have individual meetings with the Environment Department, yes, the goal is to absolutely try and do it during the comment period. But what I will say is, though, the document's not going to be finalized until following the comment period. So I would imagine, also given the schedule that the Secretary alluded to earlier for July, that there will be time likely after. But what I would say is that written comments on the document must be received by May 16th.
May 16th, okay. Because we had a discussion about how, I guess, the CAB is going to meet on this and get our criteria, meeting criteria dealt with prior, so that we can get comments in by the 16th. And it means that we probably are going to have to meet and get something scheduled before the end of April.
Well, so what I would say actually related to that is that the CAB has multiple mechanisms. I don't think it necessarily has to be comments. For instance, you pass the resolution related to the campaign approach. That's a great avenue. You can utilize that, and it absolutely will be considered as part of the comments that we receive. It's just, I would consider it to be sort of a different name
Okay.
rather than comments, but in your case, it can absolutely be a resolution, and we will consider it.
Okay. Max?
I had a follow-up question on your Appendix B. Can you walk us through maybe one of those milestones? And are the milestones developed by NMED, or is it by DOE, or are they mutually agreed? And secondly, are there items within that milestone that it basically allows it to be checked off as it's measurable and therefore can be accomplished, rather than an ambiguous goal saying we like to submit a report, like on the chromium they had to submit a report?
So, let me see.
Let's take the chromium, the third one down, the chromium injection well number 4.
Uh-huh.
Can you walk me through the milestone, and how do we know that at the end of the year that you feel satisfied as an oversight entity for the state of Mexico that has been completed?
Absolutely. So there is in the document, there's, and I'm trying to remember which section it is for right now, but when we talk about achieving these milestones, especially if it's something that's more of a task than an actual document submittal, there is language in the document now, in the draft, that speaks to developing a mechanism during the annual planning process that would, and DOE and NMED would need to agree on what that mechanism is, but effectively it's DOE sending us, saying we have completed this task, and then NMED needing to respond to that and certifying that yes, that has been completed. And I think there are going to be situations where we actually may even need to go out into the field and say, is it done? Yes, as a matter of fact it is. So I think that's one example, and chromium is actually going to be a good example of that, because you have extraction wells and you're also going to have injection wells, later on, that are going to be installed that we'll have to confirm have been completed.
Thank you for that explanation, and maybe from my standpoint, I hope that NMED is very careful and has the necessary resources, given the state cuts, that the extensions requested from DOE or others there is a provision that after 15 days, that if you're not response, it automatically becomes an extension. So in some of these very critical milestones, need to ensure that you do have the necessary staff to meet those obligations, because this is a contract. And lawyers will come out when penalties are being assessed, and they'll look at dates and times and responses. So hopefully, as this plan gets rolled out, that the state of Mexico doesn't provide too many cuts to your agency, so it hinders our ability to provide the oversight to clean up these sites. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Max.
Good thing the budget is that.
Do we have other questions at this point? For either Katie or, yeah, I see we do, or Secretary Flynn? Michael?
I had a question, Mr. Chairman, for Katie. Regarding the penalty amounts, since it was said earlier, touching off of Max's questions, that the penalty amounts originated from the 2005 document, how do these penalty amounts equate with today's dollars? It's 11 years later. Are the penalty amounts commensurate with similar contractual penalties throughout the country? I guess speaking for the working man, the state of New Mexico resident, we get hit with additional taxes. I know I'm paying more this year. Income tax, hunting licenses go up, vehicle registration fees go up annually for the most part that I can feel, at least in my wallet. So I just kind of want to know how these fees break down to 2016 economy.
I can start, and then you can. Sure. So, Michael, I'll start, and Katie can jump in. What we did, we looked at the agreements in place we compared New Mexico with the other cleanup agreements at different sites all over the country, and compared our penalty structure, our current penalty structure, to those penalty provisions. And what we found was that New Mexico's penalties were equal or greater than all the other sites that we had looked at. So our penalty provisions have $1,000 per day for the first 30 days, and then $3,000 per day after each day thereafter. And other sites kind of do that, have their stipulated penalties are structured somewhat differently, where they might have 90 days before there's an increase. So sites have done this differently, but the value of our fines is equal or in many cases greater than other sites. That being said, because these penalties were put in place in 2005, and because the original consent order was not met, one of the things we've been talking about internally is increasing those the penalty provisions in the agreement to make sure that there is that we want to have teeth, so that they are going to go out and get work done. We've looked at it. We're not an outlier in terms of being too low. We are at the higher end of the scale with other sites. The only other thing I would mention on the penalty side is, I think we were talking about during the break some of the feedback we heard from the questions and like Gerard's comment. I think we kind of were like, this is a great opportunity actually to make a tweak to the document to specifically talk about supplemental environmental projects, so that, again, the goal is so that these penalties aren't supposed to be kind of used as a mechanism for balancing a state budget. I live in Santa Fe. I pay our water utility rates, and reading in the paper a lot about how they're using our water utility, my bills, which go up every month, to balance other portions of the budget. And I don't like that. And for us, this isn't a revenue generator for the state of New Mexico. This is a cleanup plan, and the penalties aren't supposed to be designed to help balance a budget. Because working men and women in communities up in the north, they're the ones, when we start penalizing, if work decreases, it doesn't occur, those are a lot of small business contractors who are actually the ones out there doing the cleanup work, and I want to see that money going to them to do the work. So again, fines, I think, are necessary. They have to be part of the process. There needs to be consequences. The fines we do have compared to the other sites are certainly not at the low end of the scale. We're higher than most of the other sites. We think we can still go up, and we're evaluating whether that makes sense. But I think, again, at the end of the day, a fine means that we've failed and the Department of Energy has failed. And so my preference would be to never have to assess a fine, because that means they're doing what they're supposed to do.
Thank you, Secretary Ryan, Katie, Mr. Chairman.